Hello. Cool. All right. This is Unit 8, Topic 2, energy flow through ecosystems. So let's get started. So an ecosystem we define as the sum of all of the organisms living in a given area and the abiotic factors they interact with. So when we talk about ecosystems, we talk about two different things. We talk about biotic factors, which are those that were living or once living, uh, components of the environment, things like plants and animals and, um, you know, plants and animals, right? Abiotic factors not living. It's the physical, chemical properties of the environment, things like water or light or rocks or land. So look outside and find three biotic factors and three abiotic factors. Write that down in your packet. And cool. I can't wait to see what you did. I'll do that right now myself too. So, three biotic factors. I see a tree. I see, I see a bird. And I see the neighbors. I'm in the C building right now, so I see the neighbors. And abiotic factors, I see sunlight. I see rocks. And I see, well, I don't see the air, but I know the air is out there. All right, so let's talk. Think, pair, share. What are the first two laws of thermodynamics? Hey, Azaria, do you remember the first two laws of thermodynamics? We're going to think, pair, share it in class. So the first law is that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be transferred. The law of conservation of mass states that chemical elements are continuously recycled into the environment. Second law of thermodynamics is that exchanges of energy increase the entropy of the universe. So, actually, Amari posed the question to me once that has been tickling my brain ever since she asked it, is what would happen to the entropy in the universe if everything on Earth became immortal? And I still don't know an answer. All right, pause here to take notes. So energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can be transferred. And exchanges of energy increase the entropy of the universe. Great. This may seem like one of those like duh common sense things, but a net gain of energy results in storage or a growth of an organism. So the more energy, if we have a net gain of an energy, then that organism is going to grow. If there is net loss of energy, it results in loss of mass and then death of the organism itself. So we want that net gain of energy in our ecosystem so it can grow and thrive and be awesome. So metabolic rate is defined as the total amount of energy an animal uses in a given time. It can be measured in calories, heat loss, or the amount of oxygen consumed. We did this in our cellular respiration lab when we looked at the CO2 being consumed and the oxygen being produced other way around, by our peas. Oxygen is used in cellular respiration and CO2 is a byproduct, so an animal's metabolic rate is related to its body mass and the amount of CO2 that it is consuming or producing. Smaller organisms have a higher metabolic rate. Larger organisms have a lower metabolic rate. That makes sense if you take a look at just like the vitals of various species of animals across the globe, right? Our heart rate is anywhere between 60 and 100. If you take the heart rate of a small child, it's faster. If you take the heart rate of a cat, that's even smaller, it's even faster. So small organisms, high metabolic rate. Large organisms are low metabolic rate. Why do you think this is? Take a moment and think about it. Pause here to take notes. Awesome. So organisms use different strategies to regulate body temperature. We know this as like warm and cold-blooded. In science, we talk about it as endotherms, which is using thermal energy from metabolism to maintain body temperature. That's what we would consider to be warm-blooded. Or ectotherms, which use external sources, so sun or shade, to regulate their body temperature. Those are things like lizards, amphibians, cold-blooded creatures. So endotherms produce temperature from the inside. Ectotherms have to get it from the outside. Pause here to take notes. Okay, so this is a big concept here, is this idea of trophic levels. So we group species together in trophic levels based on where they get their energy from. So you can see down below here, you have your primary producers right at the bottom. Those are your plants. Then you have your primary consumers are the things that eat the plants. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. And because it's more of a food web, a lot of times secondary consumers will eat primary consumers and producers as well. So you may be familiar with this. Apex predators are up here at the top. They are 0.1% of the ecosystem as a whole. So yeah, each one of these we call a trophic level: primary producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary. It says third level consumer. It's called a tertiary consumer. So decomposers get from nutrition from all of the levels. They decompose everything, and recycled nutrients kind of go back into it. Sun's energy comes down into the primary producers. We know that from photosynthesis. And in all of these trophic levels, energy is lost as heat. So we're going to talk quite a bit more about this as the slides go on. So pause here to take notes for this. So unlike mass, right? Mass can be recycled. We can have an organism that dies and is decomposed and the nutrients go back into this kind of pyramid here, right? But energy cannot be recycled. So the sun is constantly supplying this energy into ecosystems, into that primary producer category. And it's not recycled, it's passed, right? Anything that's lost is lost in the form of heat. And that's that. So energy is not lost, it's just transferred. So primary producers, these are autotrophs. So they produce their own food. They use light energy to synthesize their own food. This is things like plants, but not just plants. Things like algae or photosynthetic plankton can also be a primary producer in an ecosystem. It's just anything that uses light to make energy. Some organisms are chemiosynthetic. So that means that versus photosynthetic. So chemiosynthetic is they produce food using energy created from chemical reactions. You see that a lot on like the floor of the ocean when light can't get down there to create energy. Really fascinating stuff. Oh, some bacteria and archaeoorganisms use chemiosynthesis or chemiosynthetic organisms. Pause here to take notes. All right, heterotrophs, right? They rely on autotrophs because they can't make their own food. There's autotrophs, there's heterotrophs. Primary consumers are all herbivores, so they all eat the primary producers, right? Primary consumers eat primary producers. Secondary consumers are carnivores that eat the herbivores, and so on and so forth, right? Until we get to decomposers. Decomposers get energy from non-living organic material. So leaves, woods, dead organisms, anything that dies in the forest gets decomposed by decomposers. All of these, all the consumers and the decomposers are considered heterotrophs. They cannot make their own food. They have to get food somewhere else. Decomposers include fungi, many prokaryotes. They're important for recycling chemical elements. Without them, there wouldn't be an ecosystem, right? Pause here to take notes. Okay. So the trophic structure of a community is determined by the feeding relationships between organisms. It's a food chain, but it's really more of a food web. I'm sure you've heard food chain before, where the transfer of food goes up the trophic levels. So you start down here with this little brine shrimp. Brine shrimp is eaten by the fish. Bigger fish eats that fish. Even bigger fish eats that fish. Finally, the bird eats the fish, right? In reality, it's not quite like that. It's more of like the food web, right? So the bird over here might eat all of these, right? Not just the one. The arrows here represent instead energy, not necessarily who's eating who. Pause here to take notes. All right, so here's sort of a visualization of the food chain. that you have your tertiary consumer, that's your apex predator. You have your producer down over here, that's the dandelions and the grass. The primary consumer is the herbivore that eats that. Secondary consumer eats the primary, tertiary eats the secondary. But because it's a food web, it's really, this can also eat this, that's not going to eat that. Just kidding. Awesome. So any changes to the availability of energy can disrupt these ecosystems. So for example, if energy resources change so that the number and the size of trophic levels increase, if resources change, so can the number and size of trophic levels, right? So if we have more plants, we're going to have more primary consumers. If we have less plants, we will have less primary consumers. Then everything beyond that just kind of gets wacky. A change at the producer level, just as I was saying, can affect the number and size of the remaining trophic levels. So if we have an overgrowth or an undergrowth of particular primary producers, then everything's going to get out of whack. Okay, let's talk primary production. So primary production is the amount of light energy that's converted to chemical energy. We call this like a spending limit. Think of this as the spending limit for the entire ecosystem. This is where all of the chemical energy comes from, is our primary production. Gross primary production is the total primary production in an ecosystem. Net primary production is GPP minus the energy used for the primary producers for respiration. Don't worry too much about these. Just know that your gross primary production is everything together. Your net primary production is everything together minus what we took to get here. Pause here to take notes. Okay. So satellite images show that different ecosystems have varying MPPs. What areas have higher MPPs and why? Well, you can see over here the darker green has higher MPPs, right? And these are areas that are really kind of lush, right? There's a lot of greenery. This is where the Amazon is. This is kind of also like a Congo jungle region, sub-Saharan, right? Then you have a lot of rainforests and monsoon areas right around there. So you can see that the areas that have higher MPPs are like that because they can support a lot more primary producers. Cool. All right. Secondary production is the amount of chemical energy in a consumer's food that's converted to new biomass. So we use a 10% rule for this. Okay, so if you have 1,000,000 kilograms of phytoplankton, you're only going to have 100,000 kilograms of zooplankton. Going up, you lose 10%. So there's a 10% loss in efficiency across each trophic level. We call that the 10% rule. And we see that all over the place, even in terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems. They're all over the place. That's just kind of what it is. It's the rule, 10%. Pause here to take notes. So unlike energy, matter cycles through ecosystems. Do you have is your ride here? Okay. Matter is found in limited amounts, right? Unlike solar energy. So biogeochemical cycles, nutrient cycles that contain both biotic and abiotic factors. Okay, so this is like the water cycle, right? Matter cycles through ecosystems. It's found in limited amounts. Sun's always going to be shining, but the water's not always going to be flowing. I'm sorry, I got distracted by dismissing a child. Okay. Water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles are what we call these biogeochemical cycles. You may have heard of the water cycle, maybe even the carbon cycle, but nitrogen and phosphorus might be new to you guys. Okay, so let's start with the water cycle. The biological importance is water. That's it. We need water. When I was teaching K through 2, I used to go evaporation, condensation, precipitation on my mind. It's all part of the water cycle and it happens all the time. All right, but that's K through 2. We're in AP. So you also need to know that there's transpiration from plants that contributes water to this water cycle. There's also things like groundwater and surface runoff that will contribute to this water cycle. And then, of course, evaporations from everywhere there is water. So just as long as you know the importance of it. Water, that's the importance of it. Carbon cycle. Carbon is essential for life, required in the formation of organic compounds. So we get it from quite a few places. This is a big one. Fossil fuel production. This is accelerating, right? Global climate change. It's just not good. But we do get carbon from other areas. Obviously, we get it from CO2, right? We breathe out CO2, it goes into the atmosphere. Some of it's taken in by plants. Some of it gets exchanged with the water. Water is actually a really good carbon sink. Marine biota, so things that are living in the ocean, can also be a source of carbon. Deep ocean is a source of carbon, of course, soils and plants and that sort of thing, vegetation. So here's the carbon cycle. It goes up into the air, goes down back into the soil through the plants, also gets trapped in the oceans. And it's important for all life. Done, period. End of story. That's it. Nitrogen cycle. Now, the nitrogen cycle is important for amino acids and proteins and nucleic acids, but it is a little bit more complicated. So you have atmospheric nitrogen just kind of hanging out in the atmosphere. Our air is mostly not oxygen, it's mostly nitrogen and argon and other things. There's some bacteria that's living in roots called nitrogen fixing bacteria, and that will allow that nitrogen to become available to plants. Decomposers breaking down plants will also release nitrogen. Nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil will release it in the form of ammonia. We call that ammonification. Nitrification too brings it back to the nitrates. So it's really all kind of a cycle between the nitrogen in the atmosphere, the nitrogen that this bacteria is giving us, the nitrogen from the decomposers, and that's about it, right? So the nitrogen cycle happens mostly in the soil, whereas things like the water and the carbon cycle happen mostly in the air or in the atmosphere. Phosphorus cycle is another important one that you may or may not have heard of. It's important for nucleic acids, phospholipids, and ATP. It comes from weathering and erosion that will go down into the ocean. Dissolved phosphates will be there, and it kind of goes through its own cycle over here between marine plants and animals. Some of it goes down into sediments in the rock to be transformed into rocks later, surface rocks. Another big source of phosphorus here is animals and fertilizer runoff. Again, that'll go into the soil. If there's too much phosphorus in the soil, it's not going to be good for the plants. Plants could die. But this is another sort of cycle that we see in our ecosystem. I think there's only one more left. Just kidding. That's it. That's the end of unit 2 of topic 2. Congratulations, you made it. I'll see you tomorrow.